One of the most practical uses of gels is to change the color of your background. So instead of owning many different seamless colored papers, you can own 1 or 2 seamless and change the color to anything you want. So in this example, I'm going to be using a Savage Fashion Gray paper seamless background. I'm going to use that to change it to any color, but in this case, we're going to change it to blue. Now, we've already talked about how gels and light are like water. So as we move forward, remember that gels show up most in shadow areas. And if white light's hitting it, it's going to be washed out. It's going to lose its saturation. So to start off with, I'm using one light here. I'm using a white beauty dish. Nothing on it, no other lights on. And I'm going to take a shot. So let's just see what that looks like. So you'll notice she's correctly exposed. And what color is the background? Well, you'll see as you glance at it, the background is kind of the color it is in real life. It's a medium gray, and there's a little bit more shading on the right-hand side of the frame because her body is casting a shadow. So what does that say to me? Well, that tells me that some of this white light, some of this light is hitting the background, which means if I add a gel to it to change the color, this white light is probably going to wash it out. But we can check that and see it in reality. Stephen, can you turn on the blue light in the background? So what we have set up here is I have another strobe on a floor stand. I often use floor stands when I'm changing the color of my background because it puts that light directly behind my subject, and then it gives me more even illumination instead of having a brighter color or brighter light on one side of the frame or the other. So I've turned on the blue gel. I'm not going to change anything. We're going to take another photograph. So taking a look at this photograph, what color is the background? You do see a little bit of blue. You see a little bit of blue, but it's a very pastel, washed out blue, and it actually gets even lighter of a blue, a little bit more of actually a gray towards the top of the frame. The reason being, this white light is hitting the background and washing out the color. So if I want to have control over the background and make it a rich, saturated color, what do I need to do? We already talked about the fact that gels show up most in shadow areas. So I need to make the background a shadow. And how do I do that? So there's several different ways that I can make less of this light reach the background. First way is I can move both my model and my light further away from the background. The further they are, the less light that will reach the background, and then that blue gel is going to show up more saturated. But for the example of this tutorial, let's assume that you're in a small space. You can't really back the light up much further. Another thing you could do is actually bring the light closer to your model. This is something that is achieved through the inverse square law. What happens is when that light moves closer to the subject, you're actually going to have to close down. More light is hitting your subject. You're going to have to use a smaller aperture, turn down the power. And even though more light's hitting your model, less light is going to reach the background. So if you don't know about the inverse square law, definitely check out my class, Master Studio Lighting, and it will get you all up to speed on this. So first way is you can move the model and the light further from the background. Second way is you can move that light closer into your subject. The next way is if you are using a softbox or a larger light source, you can feather it away from the background. You can actually change the angle. So right now that beauty dish is pointed straight at the background. All of that light is going to hit the background. You can try angling it away so that it's pointed off to the side, and then less of that light is spilling on the background. With a beauty dish, there's actually a sweet spot of light, so you can't get away with that as much, but for a 3-foot octabox or an umbrella, that would be a good solution. You can also flag your light, which means what you could try is you could try feathering your light and try putting something in between your light and the background to make it so that it's blocking the light from hitting the background. As you can see, there's lots of different solutions. They have pros and cons. Sometimes you have to worry about things being in the way and what modifier you're using. So I'm going to tell you one of my favorite solutions. One of my favorite solutions is to add a grid. Stephen, will you add a grid to the main light for me? So grids. Grids are one of my favorite tools in lighting. They really control the spread of light. One of the things they do is they narrow the beam of light so it isn't spreading as much off to the sides. But when you add a grid to the light, it actually makes the light fall off faster. In other words, when I add a grid to this beauty dish, now less of that light is going to hit the background. Actually, Stephen, will you turn off the background light for me? I just want you to see this. And beauty dishes have grids. This is a honeycomb one that fits in the front, but they make grids for softboxes. They make grids for large softboxes, octaboxes, many different modifiers. So this isn't just a beauty dish solution. So right now we've turned off the background light. We have the beauty dish with the grid on it. Let's see how it looks. So you can see the background is a very, very dark gray. It maybe has a little bit of detail in it. So if I want it to be pure black, a complete shadow, the next thing that I could do is move my subject further away from the background or move that light closer to my subject. Can you take one scoot up? Right there. Great, she's going to be a little brighter because she moved closer. So I'm going to turn down the power just a bit. Okay, so that's giving me now a pure black background. A pure black background says to me that it is completely a shadow, which means any gel that I give it, it's going to absorb it and make it super saturated in that color. So now will you turn on my background light? So before, remember, you saw that blue was very washed out, very pastel, but that's because the beauty dish light was hitting the background. So now, none of the light's hitting the background. We've turned that gel back on, and let's see what the color looks like. And now we're getting a much more saturated blue, much more pleasing, and much more what I was going for in this shot. If you wanted a pastel, you can actually purposefully have your main light hit the background. All right, so this is one way to light the background, but what other options do you have? One of the reasons I like using gels to light the background is because it gives me more flexibility than just having a piece of seamless paper. I can do more creative things with it. So let's talk about what I can do to change the look of this background using gels. The first thing I can do is I can give myself a bit of a gradient. So instead of the background being more evenly lit, I can make some parts brighter than the other. I think a good use in a beauty shot or something like this is having it be brighter at the bottom of the frame and then fade to darkness near the top of the frame. So Stephen, can you take that light and we're going to control it by moving it closer. Because you move it way up close, perfect, and then angle it up a little bit. So now since the light is closer to the background, it's going to get brighter at the bottom, but since it's angled up, it's going to be bright in the bottom and it's going to fade to darkness towards the top of the frame. Let's say that I want this effect to be more exaggerated. Stephen, can you turn the light up a stop and a half? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it even brighter. Remember how I said you can't exactly get the right exposure of light? It's more the effect you want. Well, you can't get the right distance. It's more the effect you want. So I have the light close so that I get the gradient. We turned up the power so that it's going to be much brighter at the bottom of the frame. Great. So now it's a little bit more of a lighter toned blue and then it fades up. Let's say that that is the opposite of what I wanted to do. I actually wanted the light to be more even. Stephen, can you move the light as far back towards her as possible? When you are lighting your background, you have to remember that distance matters. So I showed you what bringing it in closer really does. Stephen, can I have the zoom reflector? Great. So remember light like a bucket of water. If I'm throwing a bucket of water at a wall and I throw it here, really, really close, the water doesn't have room to spread out. It's going to stay very focused, which is what you saw in the first example. The light's going to be more focused, have a hot spot. But if I throw my bucket of water from a further distance, the water has more time to spread out, which means it more evenly lights the background. So if you are trying to more evenly light the background and you only have one light to do it, try to pull that light and your subject as far from the background as you can. Try to get many feet because that gives the light more time to spread out and more evenly illuminate that background. So Stephen has pulled that light back towards our subject. It'll give us more even spread. So if you compare these two shots, you see a drastic difference. One is focused, it has a gradient. The other is nice and even. Neither one's right or wrong. It's all about what you're trying to achieve. So making the background even or making it a little bit more gradient is not the only thing you can do. But speaking of gradient, I introduced you to the grid on the beauty dish. I want to show you one of my favorite tools to use on the background, which is grids for the background lights. Now grids, they look like a lot of different things. It depends on the brand that you have. Sometimes it'll be a zoom reflector and then the grid actually fits in the front. But for my pro photo lights, they actually fit onto the front of the light. So this is what my grids look like. And again, I mentioned that grids control the spread of light. So if I want a really dramatic halo or like a beam of color behind my subject, I'll use one of these. Now, without going into grids in depth, basically they come in different sizes, different amounts of focus. This one's a 5-degree grid, and you'll see that the holes in the front are smaller. So how you remember it is the smaller the number, the smaller the holes, the smaller the area it lights. So 5 degree is going to be very focused. And over here, this is a 20 degree. 20 degree has bigger holes, bigger number, and it lights a bigger area. Now these numbers, they don't mean anything specific to you because some brands are going to have maybe 15, 30, 45. Like the degrees, they vary, but based on your brand, the smaller the number means the more focused it'll be. So in this example right now, I have the light nice and even, but let's say I wanted just like a spotlight of blue behind my subject and it to drastically, quickly fade to shadow. Let's actually take a 10-degree grid and put it on the background. This was 5 and 20, and there's a 10-degree in between. So what this will do, it's going to focus the light. Typically when I use a grid, I'm using my modeling lights because the grids are such narrow beams of light, I want to place them precisely, whether it's on my subject or on the background. Now in this case, when you look, it doesn't look like the modeling light's on, and there's 2 reasons that you can't see it. Reason number 1 is the gel that we're using is a very thick, saturated blue. And that thick gel, what it does, it cuts a lot of light out, and it cuts out of the strobe, but it also cuts it out of the modeling light, so it makes it more difficult to see. The other reason that it's difficult for you to see is that right now there's very bright lights on me for filming, and what that does is that brightens up the environment and it makes it so those are difficult to see. Typically, if I'm shooting, I wouldn't have bright lights on me. In fact, I'd turn down all the house lights. I'd turn down the overhead lights. I'd close curtains, any of that, so that I'm eliminating as much ambient light as possible, and it makes it easier for me to see the modeling lights so I can more carefully place grids and gels in the scene. So let's take a shot now that we've added that 10-degree grid. Okay, so looking at this photo, I think you can see why I like this effect. It's more dramatic of that gradient, and then it fades to black. And so it gives me some control that I might not have using just a plain seamless background. But one of the other reasons I like to use gels is because I can make my background be multiple colors. I don't have to just stick with one. And in fact, I can add more depth by adding additional colors. So when I look at this shot right here, I already know there's another way that I can add additional colors. So we know that gels show up most in shadow areas. Looking at this photo, where are the shadows? Well, of course, there's shadows on her face, but there are also shadows in the background around the edges of that grid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce another light, and that other light is going to give me another color to the background. So Stephen, can you bring that zoom reflector in? We're going to add a zoom reflector with a magenta gel. So I'm going to have Stephen place this facing the background, but not close, because if it's close to the background, it's only going to light a small area. What I want is to think of the bucket of water. If it's a magenta gel, I want it to have time to spread out and light more of the background. Can you bring it as far back without hitting her as possible? Let's try there. See, it's going to hit her a little bit. Keep moving in a little more. Let's try there. So let me give it a test and see how we're doing. All right, so you see a couple things happening here. We've added the magenta gel. And what it did is it soaked up in the shadow area. So you see pink around the outsides. But you also notice that blue in the middle. The blue in the middle, it became a little bit more purple because the blue and the magenta mixed and gave me more of a purple. But there's one other problem in the shot. And it depends on if this was on purpose or not. But if you look at this side of her face, you're getting a little bit of spill. That magenta gel is hitting her from the side. Now this might actually be a creative use of a single light for multiple purposes. It's lighting the background and it's acting as a rim light. But let's say that's not what you intended. Well, you have to find a way to block it off. One of my favorite, inexpensive, simple ways to control the spill of light is using something called cinefoil. Cinefoil is black tin foil, but it's made for this purpose. It's actually made for theater lighting. It's actually made for this type of purpose to put on lights, to control the spill, and it's not going to catch on fire. So what we're going to do is we're going to add that to the light, tape it on with gaffer's tape, and just block where it's hitting our subject. All right, Stephen, will you tape this on for me? And so I'm getting this kind of pink and purple background with multiple layers, and I can imagine having styling that was pink and purple that would fit this idea for the color of the background. All right, so let's try it now with the flag. So now you don't have the highlight on the side of her face, but you still have the nice gradient of color on the background. So this is one way that you can add multiple colors to a background to create depth. But let's assume that you don't have multiple lights to dedicate to the background. Let's just say that you have one light on the background, but you want to have multiple colors to give it a little bit more interest. So there is a way to do that. One of the things that you might try is layering up multiple gels on your background light. So instead of just having one on top, you actually line up two side by side. And so it's going to project colors in either direction. Another way you might see it would be one top and one on the bottom. Imagine that you're trying to make more of a sunset look. You could actually layer orange and yellow gels to give you that sunset look and feel. So Stephen, let's actually bring out a zoom reflector. We're going to take a zoom reflector, do half pink and half blue. And that's going to give us a duotone background. Right there. So looking at the shot, I have the nice colored pink purple on the left and a little bit more of that bluish purple on the right. So far I've talked about how to take a background and add these interesting color effects and grids. But what happens if your real goal is just to get a nice, evenly lit color background? Right now you'll notice that I've been taking beauty shots or crop shots. And the reason is that that light, the single light behind her, is not evenly lighting the background. It's going to be hotter in the center, and it's going to fade to shadow on the edges. As I mentioned, one solution would be to take that light and pull it as far back as possible towards our subject, giving it a little bit more even spread. But if I'm doing a 3/4 length or close to full length shot, it's not going to be even enough. So when I want to light a background evenly, I go ahead and I use two lights in the background, one from either side. Now, when you use a hard light, in this case we're using a zoom reflector or you're using a bare bulb, you will get a hot spot. It's going to be brighter in the center and then it's going to fade to shadow on the edges. But if you want more even illumination, you need to use a soft modifier. You could use soft boxes, you could use umbrellas, and typically I use umbrellas because they're more portable, they're easier to set up, and they're less expensive than soft boxes. So when I'm lighting my subject for a wider shot, I'm going to put two umbrellas, one on either side. I use small white umbrellas, gives me that soft, even illumination, and then I get more even spread because they kick the light out to cover more area. The zoom reflector, it's a little bit more focused. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to gel this background, let's do blue, and we're going to put one light on either side. Okay, so we brought out our two umbrellas, one on either side, small umbrellas, white with that blue gel, and I have them approximately even size and about the same power. That way it'll give me the most even background possible. So I'm going to take a close-up, and then we're going to take a little bit of a wider shot. Before I do this, I did want to mention about getting full-length shots. If I actually want to take a photo from head to toe of the subject and light the background with a gel, it becomes a little bit difficult. Because if I actually want to light the paper that she's standing on, well, that light is going to bounce on her. I can light the background, but it'll be clear that the paper that she's standing on doesn't have that same color. So when you have many gels, like you're lighting with multiple gels from the front, that problem kind of goes away. It masks the problem. But if you're using white light on your subject in the front and gelling in the background, it's going to be obvious that the paper is gray or white or whatever you're using. So most of the time, I gel my background if I need a close-up shot, 3/4 length, even below the knees. But as soon as it is full length, I usually have to switch to paper unless I'm using gels on the front of my subject, which again, hide that problem. All right, so let me take a beauty shot. Okay, so here is a closer shot that shows a nice even illumination. Perfect. Can you do me a favor? I want to take a shot of her standing. Can you raise this light up for me? And I'm going to have you stand. Thank you. So I'm going to take a shot just about a little bit below her knees, and you'll be able to see that it's nice and evenly lit for two reasons: soft modifier and one on either side. All right, perfect. Take a couple steps forward, right there. Beautiful. So I'm bringing just about to her knees. So when you look at the background now, it's much more evenly lit because I use soft modifiers, and I use two of them, one from either side. Before we leave the discussion of gelling the background, I did in this setup want to show you a little trick that sometimes I do. Let's say you're looking at this shot and you think it might benefit from giving her a little bit of rim light, maybe one on either side. The problem is you don't have 2 extra lights to do this. One of the things that I'll frequently do is I'll actually take those 2 backlights, I'll feather them and turn them towards the subject, a little more towards the camera. That way, they purposefully spill on our subject. Remember before with that pink gel and it was spilling on the side of the face on accident? We're going to do it on purpose this time. So Stephen, you want to feather with me? So we're actually just looking for a little bit of light to spill on our subject. Let me give it a test. Great. Let's see. Okay. Perfect. So it's not really strong rim lights, it's just little hints of the color on either side of her face, but it may serve to unify her for the background. So with these shots, you see that those 2 backlights are now actually acting as rim lights. It is not something I'm saying you should do in every shot, but it's something that you have the option to do, especially when you're using modifiers like these that have a lot of spill. So to bring it all together about your background light, first you need to check that there's no spill light from your main light source or other white light in the room. That's allowing you to have more saturated colors on the background. Then when you light the background, you can do so with 1 light. If you center it behind your subject, it's going to give you more even illumination on that background. You can add a grid or move the light closer to have the light be more focused. You can also add additional lights to add more color washes across the scene, or if you only have 1 light, you can layer up gels on that single light to give you multiple colors. Now finally, if you were shooting things a little bit more full length, you may consider adding 2 lights with soft modifiers. Soft modifiers allow you to avoid the hot spot, and they give you a more even spread of light across the background so you can get nearly head to toe. Remember, if you're using gels for head to toe, you're not going to be able to light the ground in a way that is going to be even. So it's usually something that I will do for 3/4 or a little bit of a wider shot. When you're gelling a background, you have to consider the color of that background. And you want to start with a neutral canvas. So you want to choose something like black, white, or gray. Now personally, I use gray. Sometimes I use white, but let me explain why. The reason I don't use black is because it absorbs too much light. So it ends up being that I have to have my lights basically on full power to get the color to actually show up, and I don't think that's really effective. Also, the color, it fades to black far too quickly on a black background. Now white. White is a great option. The reason white can work so well is because it's a nice pure light canvas. The colors show up really quickly and they show up really vibrantly. And also they don't fade to darkness quite as quickly because it is a light toned background. I also will choose a white background anytime that I'm trying to go for some pastel colors or something that's a little bit more muted. However, the reason I sometimes don't choose white is because it's more susceptible to light leak in the room, meaning let's say I have a softbox or a large umbrella lighting my subject. Well, it's more likely that some of that light is going to hit the white background and reflect and make my colors look more dull. I find it a little bit easier to control the light when I'm shooting on a gray background. So when I use a gray background, I do have to turn up the power of my lights a little bit more than I would have to on white, but not as much as I would on black. But I can still get super saturated colors, and especially if I'm using a lighter gray, I feel like it's the best of both worlds. So typically I'm shooting on a fashion gray. It gives me vibrant colors. It allows me to not have to worry quite as much about light spilling on it. And it's also, again, that neutral canvas that I need to be able to gel it to be any color that I want.